is there somebody in the administration that's in charge of selling this to the American people?
The action that we took and the bottom line that we, the United States and the United States military does not walk away and leave behind members who are held prisoner during an armed conflict.
Just to follow up on the last question too, does the President share the concern that has been voiced by some members of families of existing prisoners that their lives may be in enhanced jeopardy because of this?
I think it's fair to say that Americans in that conflict and elsewhere have put themselves in harm's way on behalf of us and everyone in the United States for quite a long time. And I don't think that the decision to seek in complete consistency with our history the release of a POW alters that equation at all, any more than it did when we engaged in exchanges with the North Koreans or with the Japanese or others in previous conflicts in our history. Jim.
Since it appears at least that the sergeant walked away from the base without his weapon, was not involved in actual combat at the time, did the National Security Advisor misspeak when she said that he served with honor and distinction? And if she did not misspeak, how did he serve with honor and distinction?
Again, you're citing a circumstance with a lot of ifs attached to it. I would refer you to the Defense Department in terms of its assessment and review of the circumstances under which Sergeant Bergdahl was initially detained. And I would point you to what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs said about his successful recovery and its consistency with an ethos that has long been held here in the United States and by our military.
My question is not about whether or not there should have been a deal to release him. My question is about the words used to describe his service. He was promoted during his captivity, and Susan Rice said he served with honor and distinction. Is that true?
Well, I would certainly refer you to the Defense Department. You noted his promotion, and I think since this goes to questions about his initial detention, the Defense Department is the body that has been reviewing that and will continue to review it now that Sergeant Bergdahl has been recovered. The fact of the matter is he was held captive by an enemy force in an armed conflict with the United States and our allies for 5 years, and consistent with centuries of past practice. We sought to recover him and successfully recovered him.
On the other side,
Did the President and his team believe that Bill Bergdahl might be killed by his captors, and that is the exigent circumstance you referred to?
Anytime you have a prisoner held against his will for as long as he was, he is by definition at risk. It is also the case that his health...
an immediate risk.
It is also the case that his health was a concern, and justifiably so. I can't get into all the information that we had available to us, but I think you've seen reports now out of Germany that he's getting health care for conditions that require hospitalization, and that was a concern. And the package of concerns, including the opportunity to recover him after 5 years, and given the past history, the understanding that that opportunity may not present itself indefinitely, the fact that his health was deteriorating, the fact that the circumstances of his captivity were, by definition, threatening. It was the right thing to do to take action to secure his release.
Do you disagree with the characterization of the 5 released detainees as among the hardest of the hard and possibly responsible for the deaths of thousands of people?
Well, I would simply say that we have a long history in this country, and our allies do as well, of exchanging prisoners in an armed conflict, especially when that armed conflict is coming to an end. As you know, because the President announced it recently, we are bringing our combat mission in Afghanistan to an end. We have also put forward a plan whereby we would sustain a significantly reduced military presence in Afghanistan after the end of the combat mission to continue to train Afghan forces and maintain a counterterrorism posture there as we wind down to zero in several years.
Call easier, and was it nevertheless still a difficult call to release these 5?
You know, I'm not going to get into all the specifics except to say that when it comes to the 5 individuals that you are referencing, as the Chief of Staff noted earlier, this has been, these 5 have been identified as potential transferees as part of this release of Sergeant Bergdahl for some time. And it was the assessment of the Secretary of Defense in consultation with the full national security team that there were sufficient mitigation steps taken by Qatar and assurances received by the United States that these detainees do not pose a threat to U.S. national security, and that it was therefore in our interest to take action to recover Sergeant Bergdahl.
To what degree were those assurances solidified when the President talked to the Emir Wednesday at West Point?
Well, the President has had a couple of conversations, I think more specifically a phone call to the Emir, and he did have a meeting at West Point, but this was a process, again, that had been ongoing for a long time.
So nothing was solidified there that wasn't already understood?
I don't want to get into too many details about presidential conversations, but this process was fairly completed by then.
One last question. The International Red Cross has expressed some surprise that it was not in any way, shape, or form brought into seeing the transferees before they were moved out of Gitmo, which is something that has been happening with their participation and awareness of before. Can you explain why that decision was made?
I'd have to refer you to the Defense Department. I'm not sure about all the questions around that. I can simply point you to the general approach we took here, which was to make sure that we were able to recover Sergeant Bergdahl. Once he was safely in U.S. custody, we began notifications to Congress, and the process began to transfer the 5 detainees. Kristen.
Jay, thanks. I want to follow up on the question about Susan Rice's comments about Sergeant Bergdahl serving with honor and distinction. You referred the question to the Defense Department, but she's a White House official, so can you say
I
why
referred the question about circumstances surrounding his initial detention by the Taliban.
Honor and distinction?
Again, this goes to, I would echo what Chairman Dempsey said. I would echo what National Security Advisor Rice said. I would note what the Department of Defense has done with regard to Sergeant Bergdahl. And I would note that the issue of all of the information surrounding his initial captivity or detention by the Taliban is something that the Defense Department is reviewing. But I think that it is absolutely a fact that a member of the U.S. military, a uniformed member of the U.S. military, was held captive by an enemy force in an armed conflict, and in keeping with a long history in our country, backed by an ethos that says we don't leave our men and women in uniform behind, we were able to successfully secure his release.
Understood, but does the President stand by Susan Rice's comments that he served with honor and distinction?
The President stands by actions that he took as Commander-in-Chief to secure the release of the only member of the U.S. military held as a POW from either the Iraq or Afghanistan wars. It was absolutely the right thing to do.
So you're not going to weigh in?
I think I've said 3 times now that we all stand by what the Defense Department has said, what Chairman Dempsey said, and what all the members of the National Security Team have said.
I want to go back to the assurances that you got from the Qatari government. It's my understanding that those assurances last for a year. So what happens after that year, Jay? What do you say to the American people? What's protecting national security interests beyond that year?
What I can tell you is that, without getting into too many specifics about the mitigation that comes with this transfer, that there is a travel ban that is associated with it, there is monitoring that is associated with it, and that altogether, the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Team concluded that there was enough and sufficient mitigation of the threat that this was the right thing to do, that the threat was not that the transfer of these detainees did not pose a significant threat to the United States.
Enough mitigation for how long, though?
Enough mitigation. I don't have the details of the circumstances of how the Qataris will follow the detainees and monitor the detainees and all the aspects, obviously, of the interaction that we have with the Qataris around this matter. But it is the determination of the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Team that that threat is mitigated.
Can you say yes or no? Does it extend beyond that?
Again, I just don't have more details to provide to you.
Okay.
Subjects. Was the White House aware when it invited Sergeant Bergdahl's parents here Friday of his father's apparent Twitter communication with a man described as the spokesman for the Taliban, commitment to free all of the prisoners in Guantanamo, for example?
I don't know the answer to that. The fact is, they are the parents of Sergeant Bergdahl. Their son was held in captivity for 5 years. And it was absolutely the right thing to do for the Commander-in-Chief, for this administration, to take action to secure his release, the last prisoner of war from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about the decision to invite them here. There are a lot of people who feel that some of the communication he had with this guy was improper.
Well, I don't know about those communications or what a lot of people feel. The President believes we ought to close Gitmo. So does senior members of the National Security Team of President George W. Bush, including President George W. Bush. We believe we ought to close Guantanamo Bay because the costs are excessive, the harm to our national security is real, and we continue to take steps.
The commitment was to free the inmates.
Well,
and get
that's
them.
not our position, Wendell, but you can, I mean, whether or not that's, whoever holds that position, it doesn't pertain to this issue. The fact is Sergeant Bergdahl was held captive by an enemy force in an armed conflict with the United States, and consistent with past practice in this country and an ethos adhered to by our military, we brought him home, or we're bringing him home.
Difference.
Mark, and then Connie.
Jay, is there a policy that bars U.S. negotiating with terrorist groups?
Mark, on the issue of negotiating with terrorists, I would point you that we are in an armed conflict with the Taliban in Afghanistan. They are not, we don't get to choose our enemies when we go to war. The Taliban held Sergeant Bergdahl, and we successfully recovered him, consistent with past practice and consistent with an ethos that says we, the United States of America, the U.S. military, do not leave our men and women in uniform behind when they're held captive, and that's and it was consistent with that principle that we have pursued for years Sergeant Bergdahl's recovery.
Does the U.S. still regard the Taliban as a terrorist group?
We regard the Taliban as an enemy combatant in a conflict that has been going on in which the United States has been involved for more than a decade. And in this case, although, as you know, we dealt with the Qataris in order to secure his release, it was absolutely the right thing to do because he was a uniformed member of the U.S. military who was in captivity as a prisoner, not as a hostage. And so we sought his recovery and succeeded in recovering him.
So the negotiation to obtain Sergeant Bergdahl's release is not a breach of that policy of not negotiating with terrorists.
It is absolutely consistent with decades, and I venture centuries, because we've had more than two now in the United States, of past practice when it comes to prisoners of war and exchanges of prisoners. I think if people want me to end in time for this conference call, just shout. Connie, you have one?
Would you consider becoming ambassador to Russia? What do you
I was asked as Connie, and nobody's offering that job, and I'm not headed to Russia.
What's next for you?
Jay, you've given us very little detail about this deal. Can you at least assure the American people that the Taliban that are going back, going over to Qatar, will not be involved in Taliban activities 2 or 3 years from now, that they'll not be right back doing what they had done previously?
What I can tell you, Keith, is what I've said already, is that the Secretary of Defense, in consultation and coordination with the full national security team, made the conclusion that the mitigation efforts were sufficient when it came to the assurances we received from the Qataris and the communications we've had with them, that these 5 detainees do not and will not pose a significant threat to the United States, and it was in the national security interest of the United States to secure Sergeant Bergdahl's release.
I've heard that, but you can't say that they'll be back with the Taliban in a couple of. You can't say that that won't happen.
You
can't tell us
I don't predict the future, Keith, and
that's,
you
that's
probably
pretty
do
important.
as
That's a pretty
on your
important.
website. But what I can
point.
tell you is consistent with past practice.
Okay.
We have received assurances and are confident that there is sufficient mitigation.
One more quick one. You're sort of setting this up as kind of a routine, or maybe not routine, but within the tradition of prisoner of war exchanges. The people that you're exchanging are alleged mass murderers and abettors of terrorism, proven abettors of terrorism against the United States. Can you describe a previous time when people of that caliber have been exchanged for a prisoner during time of war?
What I can tell you is that there have been prisoner exchanges in our past. There have been prisoner exchanges consistent with this action by our allies and by the United States in conflicts where there was a great deal of loss of life on both sides.
Have we sent alleged mass murders of civilians back, Shiite civilians?
All I can
back
tell
in
you is
exchange for our soldiers?
Sergeant Bergdahl is an American member of the military who was held captive by our enemies for 5 years. And it is absolutely the right thing to do, consistent with U.S. history, consistent with an ethos that was identified by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that we secure his release in the way that we did. And it was the right thing to do. Thank you all very much.
We noted that our private security in Afghanistan appears to be a major source of payoffs to the Taliban. Our report has the first official statement that it's the second largest source of money for the Taliban.